Welcome to The Defiant. I'm your host, Taken Klein. Today, I'm joined by the driving force behind a venture that has redefined the concept of modern travel and community. Jon Hillis, the founder of Cabin, a network city for remote workers in nature, who is actively working to grow a global network of neighborhoods for people interested in community-centric living and working. Cabin exists today, and they have many different locations around the world. Cabin is a great example of merging the digital with the physical and using Web3 tools in real life. We delve into the purpose behind Cabin, how the COVID lockdowns inspired and allowed room for Cabin to emerge, the shift in the remote work mindset, as well as the flee from cities. We also get into the different governance structures that exist within the DAO ecosystem and why Cabin chose Polycentric Governance. Don't worry, Jon breaks down what that is for us. We also talk about DAO best practices, how you can get involved in Cabin communities, and so much more. But first, Jon tells us what Cabin is.
Cabin is a place to co-live with friends in nature. So we're building a global network of beautiful properties for remote workers seeking meaningful connections.
Amazing, and definitely needed during this time in the world. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about your mission and purpose? What made you start Cabin?
Yeah, so what we're building is something that we call a network city. And if you think about cities, they are places where culture tends to develop and prosperity forms throughout history. And they're typically built around the dominant technology of the era. So for the past century, most of our cities, particularly in the United States, have been built around cars. And we believe that in the 21st century, we can start building internet native cities. And if you think about an internet native city, the most important thing about the internet is that it's everywhere. And so we are trying to build cities that are not just in one place, that are decentralized into a bunch of different hubs with shared culture, economies, and governance structures.
Amazing. And tell us, are those physical cities, digital cities, or kind of a combination of both?
Yeah, so our network city spans both. So at its core, what we are building are actual physical locations where you can come stay and live. And in particular, where, remote workers or people seeking a different way of meeting other people and, solving for loneliness and some of the core problems that people experience typically in isolated environments like suburbs or current cities, can come out and live in nature, touch grass, be around a community of other like-minded people, and still be very connected to the internet. So our community ultimately is about getting together in person, but we then connect together online and are able to have and build a shared culture and to travel across different places in the network.
Amazing. And kind of thinking about some of these community members, what's the average time someone would stay in the community? Are they usually uprooting their lives and fully moving? Do they kind of share, maybe have their home elsewhere and stay there part of the time? What does that usually look like?
Yeah, so it varies. Many of our community members are remote workers, digital nomads, online creators, who like to travel around to different places. And so most of our co-living is people who are coming for 1 to 6 month stays at a given neighborhood and then either going somewhere else in the network or just traveling flexibly anywhere else in the world. But we also aspire to build neighborhoods in our network around families and around people who are looking for permanent places to live. My wife and I are having a kid in November, and so we're really excited about the opportunity to have a place that we can call home where we can grow our family, raise our kids, and still be deeply embedded within a community of both other people who are permanently living, as well as people who are flexibly traveling around this network.
Amazing. Well, congratulations. And maybe tell us a little bit about your background that inspired you to create Cabin.
Yeah. So, I think my personal story in relation to Cabin starts as far back as middle school, where I was spending a lot of time hanging out in online communities and also trying to thinking I wanted to become an architect, designing virtual houses for friends and family members. The internet and online communities had a big impact on my life. When I went to college, I discovered the joy of living in a dense residential community at a small liberal arts college, and ended up majoring in environmental studies and political science. And, I think the combination of those fields, I was interested in trying to understand how we could solve some of the big problems that were coming down the pike in the world. And so, what I came around to was that a lot of political science and political theory was sort of based around this fundamental idea of nation states, and that actually humans coordinate much more effectively in small groups. And so I tried to explore for my senior thesis how small groups could try to overcome collective action problems, which I didn't really realize at the time, but was essentially, research on DAOs. And around that same time, my college roommate showed me Silk Road, which was my first introduction to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. After college, the two of us tried to start a startup that was kind of like an early token-gated community, even though that wasn't really a thing in 2014, and certainly no one was interested in that at the time. So we, shut it down. I spent 6 years at Instacart as a director of product, and then after the pandemic hit, kind of followed my Thoreauvian dream to go build a cabin in the woods and try to start bringing together internet people at it.
Amazing. I love that journey and that you were such an early adopter. And it's exciting to see it kind of come to life. And I want to double click into the DAO space and just how you've seen it evolve in a moment. But before we do, can we talk a little bit about the solar punk movement? That I know that's come up in a lot of the podcasts that you've done. Can you explain what the solar punk community is for the listeners and why you maybe resonate with that community?
Yeah, definitely. So solar punk, is really a vibe more than anything. It's a literary and artistic movement. But ultimately what I think it's trying to do is envision positive futures where humanity has solved some of these core problems like climate change, biodiversity loss, loneliness, living in community, by interconnecting nature and people. And so I think, you typically people associate it with kind of science fiction or certain imagery. And it's one of the few areas of kind of forward-looking, future-looking, that is actually positive right now. There's so much negative science fiction and kind of doomer views of the future. And what I find so appealing about solar punk is that it basically says, hey, we actually can solve these problems. And, it actually turns out that if we just get together with small groups of people and figure out how to build organizations and society that is both high tech and high nature at the same time, that we can start to turn the tide on some of these big problems facing the world.
And, some people might write cabin off as maybe being too hippie and they don't want to necessarily try it for that reason. What would you say to that group of people?
Yeah, we're definitely not hippies, though I suppose in some ways we are hippie adjacent. I think so. We have a set of 6 guiding principles and obvious truths that we try to organize around. And one of those obvious truths is that we're our best selves living with people we admire, and that we can find those people online and then gather in person. And so our community tends to be made up of thoughtful, creative, open-minded, playful, generous people, who are highly motivated and easygoing. And so, we tend to attract people who are ambitious and have a high work ethic, but also really see the value of being around community and being out in nature. And so we certainly draw some inspiration from various historical back to the land movements and see some resonance with movements like the movement that is often associated with the hippies in the 70s. But we're operating in a different world now where instead of just going out, back to the land and trying to bootstrap from, scratch with just agriculture, we now have the internet and the ability to continue staying deeply connected globally, continue working remotely while also being in, these environments out in nature and with community.
Amazing. And how is Cabin organized? Do you identify as a DAO, or is it a company or a mix of both? And then how big are you guys right now?
Yeah, so Cabin is a DAO. We have been a DAO since the beginning. We started about 2 years ago, and it is organized using polycentric governance. And so, we think that A in DAO is an important part, autonomous, and ultimately our DAO is a network of properties that are all autonomous. They're all independently owned and operated properties in the network. We tend to think that that's important because, local governance and putting the decision making in the hands of the people most directly affected by those decisions is often, I think, the best strategy. And so we practice very local governance that's typically organized at neighborhoods around duocracy, the idea that if you want something changed, as long as it's reversible, then you should just do it. We believe that the most important governance questions to start with are questions like, how are we collectively doing the dishes? And then we can kind of grow bottom-up governance systems from there. At the level, of the DAO across this network, we collectively curate what becomes a neighborhood by voting on properties. And we also have roles and stamps that we use for identity and reputation across the network to make sure that our people and our communities are vibe and value aligned. And all of that, the roles, the stamps, the voting, it's all done using tokens and on-chain structures, but we try to put as much of that stuff under the hood as possible, because while we think it's really important to have community owned, operated structures that are capture resistant, we also understand that crypto has developed a pretty bad reputation due to rampant speculation and scams, and we think that the fundamental tools are important, but we want to make it as easy for people to use and understand how they can get real value out of these things that are not about cryptocurrencies, but are about crypto governance structures without having to really understand or be deeply involved in the underlying technology.
Amazing. And what tools are you leveraging within the Web3 space? Did you build those yourself, or are you using other dApps and networks?
Yeah, so we have built out our own app that pulls together a bunch of underlying tools into our census, which is our community directory, our city directory that has all of our properties across the network. But we're using a whole set of on-chain composable tools to accomplish this. So our roles are all done through HATS protocol. Our stamps are OtterSpace badges. And we're probably using close to a dozen composable on-chain tools in one form or another under the surface. And that's part of the magic, I think, of Web3 is that we've moved from this period where people were trying to build these like monolithic DAO tool entities to this much more flexible, composable structure that makes it easier to build real consumer use cases.
Amazing. Yeah, you need to write the playbook for all of us on DAOs, because it sounds easy, but when you kind of get into the different tools and options, it's not very easy. So amazing that you've kind of navigated that space.
Oh yeah, definitely not easy. And I wouldn't say that we've figured it all out. But there's definitely a lot of good learnings over the past couple of years that I think we've tried to document and share, primarily on our Mirror blog.
Great. And then how did you decide you wanted to kind of start a DAO? What led you down that path?
Yeah, so we didn't really start out with the goal of starting a DAO. We started out with this small group called the Creator Co-op. And it was a group of independent online creators that came together during the pandemic in 2020. And originally we were meeting online. And then at the same time, I was building this cabin in the woods in the Texas Hill Country. And as things started to open back up, I invited all the members of the co-op out to come hang out at the cabins and dream about, some of these big questions around how we could imagine new ways of living. And from that, we decided in May of 2021 to launch this creator residency so that we could invite more online creators to come out to the cabins. And in order to do that, we opened up an on-chain crowdfund that was a donation-based crowdfund for people to contribute to these residency programs and receive a token that they could use to vote on who else got to come out for the residencies. And even then, we didn't really immediately, think of it as a DAO. But as more people started showing up and getting involved and getting interested in the project, we realized over the coming months as we ran these residencies that we had created a bat signal that was attracting a lot of wonderful humans. And we wanted to continue building in that direction. And so, I think that it was kind of a fun full circle moment to realize that some of the work I'd been doing in college on the idea of small groups overcoming collective action problems, we ultimately ran into a wall with that work because there just weren't good ways to run experiments. Basically nobody was letting political scientists, run A/B tests on governance structures for nation states. And so they, that field of study had sort of hit a wall. And what we realized through the process of launching this creator residency and the DAO was that, now there was this new set of self-sovereign tools that allowed us to create capture-resistant online organizations where we could open up participation to people on the internet and start to actually run real experiments with some of these new governance structures.
Amazing. And how big is it today? How many community members are there?
Yeah. So I'm pulling up the census right now. We've got 821 members in the census, 692 token holders, and 152 of those people have become cabin citizens.
Amazing. Super exciting. And I want to kind of double click into the governance piece. So you mentioned you all picked the Polycentric Governance. Can you talk about why you chose that and what other options there were for you to kind of choose between?
Yeah, so Polycentric Governance is a term that comes from one of my academic heroes. Her name is Elinor Ostrom. And she was a political scientist, ended up winning a Nobel Prize for some of her work on polycentric governance, which basically said that rather than monolithic governance structures that we tend to think of in the context of post-Westphalian nation states, that if you go back and you just look at how humans have been organizing and gathering themselves, for thousands of years, particularly going back to examples like how irrigation networks were built and how early cities formed, that you see a very different type of governance, which is polycentric in nature, poly meaning many, centric meaning middle or center. And so what polycentric governance essentially means is governance built around many centers of power. So instead of having, one leader, you have leaderful organizations. You have lots of different local autonomous pods with their own ways of doing things and their own leadership structures. And those things, are sort of loosely collated together into larger organizations. And so these types of emergent governance systems tend to be much more resilient and successful in the long run. And so at Cabin, what that means is that we play these programmable polycentric governance games. So I'll provide a couple examples of that. I mentioned citizenship a minute ago. Citizenship is how you gain the ability to travel around Cabin's network. It is an NFT, and it is one that can only be earned by participating in one of our programs, like a Cabin Week, or by getting vouched for by another community member. And so anyone who is a citizen can vouch for another person. That's a form of distributed power that we provide to citizens, in order to help them curate and grow the network. A different form of power within the network is our Cabin token, which is our governance token, which we use to vote on community decisions like how we distribute funds from the treasury and how we curate the city directory, which is the set of properties across our network. Another example of this is our roles. So we mentioned HATS protocol and how we're using HATS for role management. That is another form of polycentric governance in which we have different groups of people like builders, gatherers, naturalists, who have skills across our network. And rather than having one central source of deciding, who gets these different roles, we've distributed that power into the hands of people across the community who best know and understand those skills so that they can be the ones to, verify who is qualified to, do those roles at a given neighborhood. So when you start to layer in, a bunch of these emergent structures like this, you end up with, I believe, a much better governance system than, the kind of classic model that a lot of DAOs fell into over the last couple of years, which is just, we're going to do decision by committee on everything. And we're going to, have a single, snapshot and multi-sig and just vote on every single thing and have every person vote on everything, which is not a very good way to do things.
So here's something new. Bumper your assets to defend them from price drops without losing upside exposure. You set a price floor and term length, then lock your tokens into the protocol. When your term ends, if the price has fallen under your floor, you leave with stablecoins at the floor's value. Otherwise, you just take back your original asset. Bumper is going live in August, and it's one of the most innovative DeFi protocols for hedging being built right now. So check out bumper.fi. There's links in the description of this video. Now back to our story.
Amazing. And decentralizing the power is key, but what's hard is a lot of people, when they have power, they don't want to then give it away, as we've seen many times throughout history. So it's nice to see you're kind of baking that into governance from the start. And we spoke about the complexity a bit ago, but what other challenges have you overcome in the DAO space specifically?
Yeah, I think there are lots of challenges. I think, basically nobody knew what they were doing here. And we were in a world where we were trying to create new organizational structures. And people were both, I think, a little naive about, learning from the past and understanding that there are actually lots of great examples of how people have organized before. And were, very excited to try out these interesting technical tools in new ways. And that led to a lot of great experimentation. But for the most part, I think DAOs have fallen into the same traps that people have always fallen into around coordination problems, particularly, tragedy of the commons and issues with, interpersonal conflicts and issues with trying to have way too many people involved in every decision. And so I think, what we have tried to do is, instead of focusing on these monolithic committees, we've tried to empower small people to make local decisions. And I wouldn't say that we've solved all the problems here by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think that we made that transition towards distributed pods and leaderful governance at a time when that was still pretty unpopular in the DAO space. And I think it's been the key to our success versus unfortunately other projects that have just gotten mired down in brittle governance structures that they couldn't find their way out of.
Yeah. And how have you avoided it becoming very political? Obviously, the crypto space has its own political movement, but then I feel like within the DAO space, sometimes a lot of other political pieces kind of come into play and distract from that mission.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two ways to think about like a political aspect to DAOs or crypto. One is like political in the sense of kind of current political structures and left-right divides and these sort of like ways of thinking that we tend to get stuck in. And I think what we've tried to do to avoid some of that is to just focus on what we call obvious truths. And these are things that are inherently not political. They're just basic ideas that we believe in and that we can align around. And if you believe in these truths, then you're probably going to be a pretty good fit within our community. So they fall into three buckets. They're about living in community, integrating with nature, and creating together. So when we talk about living in community, I mentioned our obvious truths here, that we're our best selves when we live with people we admire, and we can find our people online and gather in person. When we think about integrating with nature, we believe that touching grass is good for our well-being, and that building regenerative local communities is the best way to create resilient stores of value. And then, our third guiding principle is around creating together. And we believe that creating means doing, and that co-creation grows culture. And each of these things, can help us attract the type of people who are interested not in rehashing the sort of well-worn left-right divide that is currently, capturing so much attention and leading to so much conflict in the United States and around the world, and instead allow us to align on these sort of basic truths that help us build a new old way of living, and allow us to have a different framework through which we can view the world. And then, you can also think of political in terms of just like the politics of like conflict within a DAO and the interest that people may have in, sort of using governance processes towards their own ends instead of towards the good of the organization. I think that's something that always is going to exist. But I think the best way to deal with that problem is to just get the decision-making into, again, like small local groups who, can actually just make decisions for themselves at a human-to-human level where there's high trust and where people know each other well. And in those contexts, it's much harder for, the sort of political systems that actually plague both decentralized and highly centralized large organizations.
Absolutely. And what are some of the other best practices you've kind of learned in the DAO space, aside from what you've already mentioned?
Yeah, so I think that, talking about the DAO space is interesting because it's sort of like talking about the corporation space. Like there's lots of different types of corporations and also very different types of DAOs. And so I think there's different lessons if you're talking about investment DAOs or protocol DAOs or social DAOs. These are very different types of organizations. But at the core, I think there's actually a lot here that we can learn from history and from past examples of how decentralized organizations win and lose. Even the term DAO, I think, has just become so overloaded and used in different contexts as to become pretty meaningless. But there actually is a good history of decentralized organizations. And, this ranges from organizations like Valve, the gaming company behind Steam, to the U.S. Marine Corps, to intentional co-living communities, to Amazon. And there's pretty well understood lessons from these examples about how to scale these types of organizations. And it basically starts with getting great people. If you don't have, really amazing humans that are able to operate autonomously, and who are ambitious and passionate about the goals that they're trying to accomplish, then you really can't build these types of organizations. And that's pretty consistent across all of the ones that I just mentioned, that's their primary focus. Once you have great people, then it's about helping members self-organize. So really clearly defining the mission of the organization, the North Star, the vision that you want to point towards, so that everybody can be on the same page. And then organizing into small groups who can execute at the edges, making information really accessible, which is something that DAOs can be very good at, creating more transparent information so that anybody can look around and identify where the problems and opportunities are. And then implementing minimum viable self-governance. So trying to, not over-design the governance structures from the beginning, trying not to write a constitution. Everyone wants to just write a constitution, and they tend to forget that, the US Constitution didn't come until after the Articles of Confederation, and, messing around and trying things out for a decade. And so you don't want to over-constrain yourself and lock yourself in to something too soon. You want to evolve into the right governance structures for your organization, and then align around, providing intrinsic motivation and rewards for people that allow them to play long-term infinite games with each other and build deep community. I think if you that it's much easier said than done, all of those things, but if you can figure out how to do all of those things, you can create a type of organization that is able to operate pretty differently than what we've traditionally seen with corporations.
Absolutely. Great lessons, great learning, great advice. And it's interesting that you mentioned that Cabin was kind of born out of the pandemic. During COVID, many friends would come together, they would quarantine together, co-work, co-live. How do you think this change kind of towards remote work has shifted society to kind of move towards this community that you're advocating and building?
Yeah, certainly it's been a huge shift. And, I don't think we're ever going to go entirely back to how the world was before the pandemic, particularly in relation to remote work. So, at the time in early 2020, my wife and I were planning to leave our jobs and go travel the world for a year. And so I was trying to wrap things up at Instacart in February of 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and Instacart suddenly became crucial infrastructure for getting food to people. And so I agreed to stick around for another 6 months and help them through that transition. And at the end of that, obviously our plans to travel the world were out the window. And what I really wanted to do was to go build a cabin in the woods and invite some internet friends out. And it just became pretty evident that the future was, when we came out of the pandemic, we were going to be operating in a world where people had a lot more flexibility around their work and where they live. And if you think about cities, the main reason that a person lived in a city before remote work was for a job. And most people were just moving wherever the jobs were. And cities were what economists refer to as agglomeration job markets. And that's sort of the core thing that's understood to hold cities together. And so when that was no longer true, when suddenly there were a lot more opportunities for people to work remotely, to live wherever they wanted, we could start asking a different question, which is, if you don't have to move to a city for a job, then what types of cities could we build? And initially we just wanted to bring together people who had this sort of flexibility and to explore that model. And I think now what we've seen is that there's a lot of deep interest and excitement in living in community, out in nature, and still being able to be connected to remote work, and so that's really the core of what we're trying to build for. And I think we would have eventually gotten there, but I think it would have taken a lot longer without the pandemic really shifting the way a lot of people were thinking about how they wanted to live their lives.
Absolutely. And I think on another side of that, it's bringing the opportunity to everyone around the world. You no longer have to be able to afford to move to a city. You can now, with a Wi-Fi connection and smartphone, get opportunity and work in some of the most innovative industries in the world, which is pretty exciting and pretty powerful. And it also kind of plays into the ability to have community elsewhere outside of these big cities. And then you mentioned societal themes like loneliness, connection with nature, and this need for purpose. Philosophically, how does Cabin kind of play into those themes? How have you seen it?
Yeah, so I think as we got deeper into this project, what we realized was that we could solve some of the core problems, or at least try to solve some of the core problems that have been making Americans less happy with their lives than they've been in at least the past 50 years. So if you look at the kind of main causes of that unhappiness and declining sense of happiness, there seems to be two main causes. One is increasing loneliness, and the other one is decreasing standard of living. And so, if you look at loneliness first, it seems to have roots in a couple different places. One is the decline of America's social associations of the 20th century. So there are organizations like Rotary clubs, Boy Scouts, churches, bowling leagues. All of these things kind of peaked in the 1970s and have just been in decline since then. And this coincides with the rise of car-centric suburban living, more atomic lifestyles, shuttling single families around, to their single family homes. And then also more recently, the rise of the consumer internet, mobile phones, social media, that's created this explosion of screen time, parasocial relationships, an unrealistic view of other people's social lives that you're seeing on social media. And all of that has caused people to, be less happy than they've been in a long time. And the other part of that is decreasing standard of living. So if you look at American life expectancy, it's at a 25-year low. And meantime, the basic costs of living, the things that really matter to people, housing, food, education, healthcare, these things have doubled in cost over the last 25 years, accounting for inflation. And so while other things like software and TVs and computers have all gotten way better and cheaper, these basic costs of living have gone up, which is why people are feeling this sense of decreasing standards of living. And so we sort of realized, well, both of these problems are things that are at the core of getting us back on track towards making people feel better and have better lives. And they're both things that we can solve, at Cabin Neighborhoods by building on this new tech stack that, allows us to bring people together out in nature, build cheaper, better housing options for them, bring them together with other like-minded people, and also, be able to go out in nature and feel more connected to their natural environments.
Absolutely. And on the second point, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily view that as one of the main reasons for kind of the inequality or the standard of living decreasing. And I think maybe as an early Bitcoiner, you understand that within the monetary policy that has impacted that standard of living substantially. What are your thoughts on that, and how is Cabin kind of incorporating Bitcoin as a new monetary policy potentially, if at all?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple parts that have caused this. I think certainly being able to build new financial systems on top of crypto rails is a huge opportunity for improving wealth inequality. Honestly, I can't say that I'm confident that, any of the major cryptocurrencies have done that yet, because I think there is still a lot of inequality in ownership of cryptocurrencies. And frankly, a lot of people, particularly in the last few years, who have been negatively impacted by cryptocurrency speculation. And then, of course, lots of other people, for whom that's been a path towards wealth creation. But I think the real opportunity here is in starting to make both collectively owned systems and governed systems, as well as, building squad wealth, figuring out ways to, let groups of people come together and build local wealth for their communities. And that's what, Cabinet is really focused on. If you look at housing, for instance, one of those core basic costs of living, the big problem is that we are stuck in a regulatory environment in existing cities where it's extremely hard to build anything. And so, the sort of classic American dream of homeownership is becoming increasingly distant for a lot of younger people, because it's just so hard to build new housing in cities and to expand the housing supply. And so what we found is that by being out in more remote areas, there's typically, less housing regulation, more ability to build things. And by coming together as a community and actually helping to build these things from the ground up ourselves, we are creating, new forms of wealth that, can be accessed and can appeal to groups of younger people who, can't necessarily afford to become owners of real estate in existing urban areas.
And can you give some examples of where maybe that squad wealth has been successful, just to kind of give listeners an idea?
Yeah, for sure. So, what we are like probably flagship property is called Neighborhood Zero. We're about 45 minutes west of Austin, Texas, and that's where I live. And it's a place where we have built, the entire thing from the ground up as a community. So members of the DAO and, strangers from the internet have shown up to participate in work-stay exchange residency programs and build weeks in which we've built houses and, bathhouses and saunas and gardens and outdoor gym and, decks in the middle of the woods for throwing dance parties. And all of these things are things that are, being built by a community through this sort of democratic process where people are coming out and saying, here's a way that I want to get involved and contribute and, help build something that is a place where our community can grow and benefit from it. And ultimately, what we'd like to do is find models where we can start to bring together groups of people to build places like this, and get the ownership of these places into the hands of communities that want to do this together. That's a very hard thing to do for a lot of reasons. It's a big coordination problem. There are regulatory challenges that make it more complicated for us to do this. But I think that's like the long-term goal is to be able to build spots that can accrue value for communities and help accrue value back to the land. And so, we practice regenerative agriculture and silvopasture out at Neighborhood Zero, where we're trying to figure out how to make the soil better, how to return water to the aquifer, how to increase biodiversity so that they can be places that are good for people and are resilient and regenerative.
Amazing. And can you talk a little bit about the business model and how you kind of have funded the initial stages and how you think about long-term sustainability?
Yeah, so we have experimented with a bunch of stuff. And we have, a ways to go to figure out exactly how we can make this sustainable, but that is our primary focus, is on building long-term systems that are financially sustainable. And what that currently looks like is a co-living model. So the way that this works is Cabin has this network of properties and citizens who can travel across those properties, and we both have a subscription model to become a Cabin citizen, and then we also make money from referring members of the community to properties for short to medium term co-living experiences.
Amazing. Okay. And it's maybe kind of similar to how people would think about Airbnb.
You're, certainly paying for a place to stay. I think the big difference for us is that when you rent an Airbnb, you're just like, it's a financial transaction in which you're just like paying for a place to stay, and you're going out and you're staying in that place, and then you're like leaving a review afterwards. And at Cabin, we're trying to build places that are community first, and so it's not just a place where you're going to go and sleep for a couple nights, and then they're going to ask you to like do all this stuff to clean it up, and what we are trying to build is places where you go and it feels like home. Places where you go and there are people who you maybe already know or maybe you don't know, but they become fast friends. And you're not just stepping into a financial transaction for a place to sleep for a couple nights. You're stepping into a community and into a culture that you want to be a part of.
Amazing. And where are some of the other communities located?
Yeah, so if you're interested, you can check out our city directory at cabin.city. We currently have 22 properties around the world. And we are certainly more US centric at the moment. But we've got places in Texas and California and Washington and New York and then also places all over the world. So we've got outposts in Costa Rica and Bali and Puerto Rico and France and Japan, Slovenia. And so, the goal here is to build a global network of places that have a lot of diversity and the ability to go around and, explore the network and try things out while having a consistent set of values and vibes everywhere you go.
And is there a way for people to kind of beta test the communities before, like dip their toes in before committing? And how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a big request that we've heard from the community. We know that, committing to a long-term co-living experience with strangers in a place you've never been can be a high barrier to entry. And so we are trying to make it easier for people to test it out. The best way to do that is something that we call cabin weeks. And a cabin week is just a 1 to 2 week long experience where you can come out to a neighborhood, vibe check the community and the place, try out, what it's like to do remote co-living in a community in nature. And then ultimately at the end of it, decide if you want to continue to travel around and be a part of the network. Everyone who comes to one of our cabin weeks has the opportunity to become a cabin citizen. And we've got 4 of them coming up in the next few months in Washington, Texas, Puerto Rico, and Portugal.
Amazing. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then I assume there's different vibes across the different communities. Like, for example, like some people might need more of like a spoiled vibe where they have like a staff and security. I don't know if that's a thing, and then others might be a little bit more chill and laid back and kind of sharing responsibilities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of diversity across the network, and it's all community curated. It's up to our citizens to, post neighborhoods and outposts of the network, and then everyone to vote on which ones of those have the best cabin vibes. And so there's a lot of different places. You have some spots which are kind of our core co-living neighborhoods where you can expect to be living in community with other people and have kind of longer term residence around and a deeper sense of culture and connection. We have other outposts that may just have a couple bedrooms available, and you may be staying with a family, or you may be, staying with a smaller group of people, and everything in between. And we're really open to bringing in any neighborhoods that kind of fit our basic criteria, and then allowing the community to curate those places. So some of them have fancier accommodations where you have a full ensuite private unit with your own bathroom and kind of more full amenities, saunas and plunge pools and these types of things. And then other ones where we have lower cost options available with glamping setups or, just in places where the cost of living is lower. And so we try to have a range of options that can appeal to whatever it is you're looking for, as long as you are looking for an experience that's going to be in nature, connected to the internet, with community, and as long as you're the type of person whose values and vibe aligned with our network.
Amazing. And then how do taxes work? I assume that it's kind of up to each member to establish residency in one location, even if they're kind of bopping from place to place.
Yeah, that's right. So, we typically people are staying for multiple months at a time, but they are, could have an official residency anywhere in the world. We are agnostic to that, and are not trying to set up any sort of tax regimes or anything like that. In order to become a cabin citizen, you just pay a small annual subscription, which gets you access to travel around the network wherever you are in the world.
I want to ask about security. So I guess OPSEC comes to mind, just given people have ledgers and they're storing a lot of their wealth, potentially in their homes. How do you handle that or think about that? Is there an education or training?
Yeah, so we take safety and security really seriously, and we know that getting together with internet strangers in person is probably what your mom told you not to do when you were a kid, and so we want to make sure that we're building systems where everyone can feel really safe, and the first layer of that is just community curation. Right, making sure that we are screening people who are coming in, that we have these systems in place for citizen vouching to make sure that people who are coming into the network are vouched for by someone else, and then that we have really clear community guidelines around safety, and that if anybody is violating those guidelines, then we're removing them.
And what if it's not a community member, but what if you're targeted by a third party? How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah. So we also have I think a couple advantages here versus for the first one is just that our neighborhoods tend to be in more remote locations, and so we don't have a lot of the problems that a city would have where there's just higher rates of crime or these sorts of things, and so we've seen that we've been able to build close relationships with neighbors, and that these tend to be really safe environments in general. And then of course we also have security practices on site, like the ability to lock your door and to have gate access codes and things like that help people feel more safe.
And then for someone interested in staying at the property, maybe checking out the community to then go to become community members, can you walk us through that flow?
Sure. So, if you're interested in getting involved, you can head to our website at cabin.city. The first thing you'll see is a button to join a cabin week. And that's probably the best way if you're ready to dive in and get involved is to apply for a cabin week, which you can come out and stay and really get a sense of what it's like to be a part of our co-living community. If you're ready to, dive straight into co-living, then you can sign up for our census and get vouched for by another citizen, come out, participate in our co-living programs across the network. And if you're not quite ready to, dive into a full IRL experience, then the best way to get started is to check out our online community, hop in our Discord, hop on a welcome call or book a one-on-one call with a team member so that you can, learn more about how it all works.
Amazing. And then the last question is just, how are you defiant?
I think that at Cabin, we are trying to create a new old way of living. And we're, in a sense, trying to rebuild society from the bottom up and find, new ways of solving some of these intractable basic problems of modern Western civilization. And so I think that is an inherently defiant mission, but I wouldn't necessarily view it as like fighting against the current systems. I would view it more as trying to throw a better party. And I think we've seen that when you throw a better party, people will choose to opt into those ways of living.
Absolutely. Amazing. Well, I would love to check it out. I'm sure many of the listeners will resonate with the mission and want to check it out as well. Thank you so much for coming on. This was great.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tegan.